Encounter is brought to you by the Broome County Council of Churches, where we connect compassion with needs as we inspire growth with dignity. You'll find us in special places throughout the community. For those who remain hungry, we provide meals. For those who are challenged, we build wheelchair ramps. We comfort those who are ill, minister to those who are confined, and we remain an advocate for change and understanding on behalf of every element of our community. Connect and inspire. Encounter the Broome County Council of Churches.
Good morning. I'm Jeff Kellam, the Parish Associate at the Union Presbyterian Church, welcoming you to this week's edition of Encounter. Before we begin with our topic, which is going to be fun and interesting as we move through our half hour together, two things. One, to mention our previous co-host, Talia Moore. Talia was with us for a little over a year, I think, co-hosting the program on occasion, and she has taken a leave of absence to do something that no co-host on this program through its long history has ever done. She's having a baby, and she's having a baby in just a few weeks, so our God's blessing be with you, Talia, and your little one, and your husband, and your family. We wish you all the best. The second little personal thing is that a couple of weeks ago, my wife and I were involved in a serious bicycle accident at Hickory's Park in Owego. And so I become an evangelist for helmets. If you ride a bike, and I don't care whether it's your driveway or your neighborhood or the Erie Canal Trail, you need to ride with a helmet. My wife had a serious head injury, and it would have been far, far worse if she hadn't had that helmet on. So that's my public service announcement. When people ask me what I do or what I did before retirement, I'd say I was a Presbyterian minister and I was a jazz DJ. For years back in Richmond, Virginia, I was on the air playing jazz. I'm not a musician at all, but I have grown up with that music from my parents' big band records right through to what I downloaded last night. Because that's my favorite kind of music. I tell people that now and then. They say, I don't like jazz. And I think, well, what kind of jazz don't you like? Is it the George Shearing vibes, kind of gentle jazz that you want accompanying a fine dinner? Is it Dixieland jazz? You go to New Orleans. What do you expect to hear on Bourbon Street or at the Preservation Hall? Or maybe it's big band jazz, the music that gave an era its name, that people still dance to with the Mason Warrington Orchestra or the Blue Velvet Band. Our guests today are providing a unique ministry. When I say unique, yeah, it is. Don't use that word very often. It's Jazz Vespers at the First Congregational Church on Front Street in Binghamton. So our guests are Judy Giblin, who's the coordinator of Jazz Vespers, and the Reverend Dr. Art Suggs, a former co-host who did not get pregnant doing the show. And so welcome back to the program, Art.
Thank you very much. It's really good to be back.
Wonderful to have you both here. So this has been going on at First Congregational Church monthly, I guess, except during the summers?
Right, little break during the summer.
And you're in your 21st year. Mm-hmm. How did it start? Do either of you have
It started with a minister that was there, a permanent minister named Cliff Airy. And Cliff was a musician himself, and he felt very strongly that this needed to be part of our church experience. So he began Jazz Vespers, doing it all himself. And he also started our church gospel group. Ah. So he did a couple things that really lasted.
Yes, gospel and jazz have the same roots. Jazz really is America's indigenous popular music, and it comes out of the fields, the field hollers, and the African rhythms, and so on. And it had its birth in these sometimes shady clubs in Chicago and Kansas City and New Orleans. And now it's come back into the spiritual tradition. Jazz, I think, has its roots in the spirituals, and now has come back to find a place at home. Art, you've been the pastor at First Congregational Church for how long?
So 11 years. Yep.
And so did you find this kind of curious when you?
I did. I must admit.
Yeah.
But what I really enjoyed about it at the initial side of it was that it's an interfaith service. both interdenominational within the Christian realm, but also just interfaith service.
Yeah.
And I wanted that because, I have to spend most of my time being a Christian minister, but I really enjoy also bringing in the perspective of other religions and the perspective of science as well into it.
Right.
So I'm the one who does the meditation on it. The structure of the service, which Judy has put together for a long time, many years, is based upon the work of John Coltrane. And so in it we have the a flow to the service, and it's a spiritual flow to the service.
Yes.
But a small part of it is a meditation, which is like a sermon, but in many ways unlike a normal sermon that you would get in church.
A little bit more informal and a little bit briefer, but connected somehow to the theme.
Yes, yes.
When we were in Edinburgh, Scotland, we went to worship at a Vespers service at the St. John's Cathedral, which is kind of the Presbyterian Vatican. And they were having jazz Vespers, and a saxophone player played A Love Supreme by John Coltrane. And I took a picture of him, and I use that on my blog now. You see the sax player standing next to John Calvin's pulpit, and it's just a wonderful connection for me. And as we left the church, I said, "How long have you been doing jazz Vespers at St. Giles Cathedral?" And he said, "This is our first one."
Oh my goodness!
Yeah,
oh,
so
wonderful,
wonderful. But that's the framework, is A Love Supreme, that wonderful Coltrane spiritual work.
It is.
Yeah.
Exactly, and I want to add also that John Coltrane has been canonized, so it's Saint John Coltrane now. So it's a small denomination, but the African Orthodox Church has canonized him, and I had a chance to see the icon that they created for him. Done in the classic Russian Orthodox style of icons, but he's holding the saxophone, but it's aimed right at you. So you don't see a saxophone shape. It's aimed right at you with fire coming out of it. And it's symbolic of the spiritual nature.
Yes.
Because that's what happened with him. And in the liner notes of A Love Supreme, he tells the story of his spiritual experience that really opened up this whole idea of having such a thing as jazz Vespers.
Yeah. It's a wonderful meditation, the liner notes, because it's his creed. It's his credo.
Yeah.
So that forms the framework for this interfaith, interdenominational service. And Judy, you secure the musicians each month. Mm-hmm. And when I mentioned Dixieland, swing, and the other one, the George Shearing kind of gentle piano, all of those find their way into jazz Vespers.
They absolutely do. I've had Dixieland, and I've had one single pianist who did the entire program beautifully.
Yeah.
We're coming up on the 11th. We're going to have Miles Ahead, which is Mike Carbone and Gene Cothran, Joe Roma, Tom Westcott. They are amazing. They're just amazing.
That group, we have some photos of them playing last year at about the same time, because the church was decorated for Thanksgiving. And Bill Carter had substituted for Gene Cothran. But Miles Ahead is a wonderful straight-ahead jazz group.
It is.
And so that's coming up on November 11th.
Right.
Now tell me about some of the other groups that have played at Jazz Vespers.
I had a gentleman come down from Ithaca, and he does a very odd, I don't want to say odd, that makes it sound funny, but a very unusual combination of reggae and Caribbean and amazing musicians. Ithaca is a wonderful source, but I really like to keep as many local musicians working at this as possible.
Yes.
It just, we have some fabulous people, and I think they need to be showcased.
What I find interesting too is that the attendance at that service, it's probably one of the largest jazz venues in the area. When I go to the Firehouse Stage or to some of the restaurants that feature jazz, you have 75, 100 or more people coming monthly today.
It's a deeply loved service.
Yeah.
You know, and it's been around long enough that jazz lovers know all about it and have it on their regular calendar.
For those who don't, let's say what Sunday of the month?
Second Sunday of the month at 5 p.m.
At 5 o'clock in the afternoon.
Unless Easter happens on the second Sunday of March, April, May, that sort of thing, in which case we just move it to the first Sunday.
Right. Jazz is not something strange to the church. One of my first jazz albums was Duke Ellington's Concert of Sacred Music, which I guess was maybe the early to mid 60s. Oh. And then I have this more rare version of the Duke Ellington second sacred concert. And then Dave Brubeck, of course, one of the first pieces that I played on one of my radio programs was called A Light in the Wilderness. And Dave Brubeck's wife wrote the lyrics for all of his sacred music, and then Dave Brubeck, of course, wrote the music for one concert after another, a very highly spiritual man. And then I found some of these, when I just started going through these, Missa Laterra, the Mass of Joy, Lutheran Seminary Choir, Philadelphia, put this thing out. This is also from the 60s. And the Jazz Mass by Joe Masters. And then the other one I find is kind of the Trio ESP with Father Herrera. This is Jazz Goes to Church. So these are all religious jazz written for either liturgy or just to play in a jazz service. When your groups come, you don't require them to play spiritual songs or hymns. They bring their repertoire.
They do. And they can play anything they want to, as long as, unless someone's singing, I tell them to keep a mindful eye on the lyrics.
Yeah.
But aside from that, you know, it's not unlike anything else you would hear at any other jazz venue.
Yeah. So are there guidelines beyond the sections of a Love Supreme, Coltrane's wonderful work? Do you have other guidelines for the liturgy, or can you expect something each time? That's
very
different?
minor. There's a spiritual reading. Judy also chooses what would be called in church a scripture reading, but it's just spiritual readings from multiple different sources, whether they're different religions or poets. It always concludes, for example, with a poem that can sometimes be hilarious, or who was the...
Charles Schultz.
Yes, Charles, right. And then Where the Sidewalk Ends, that guy.
Yeah.
Shel Silverstein.
Yes, we've done a number of his.
The Giving Tree guy. Yeah.
Yes.
So there's humor built into it, but I do need to comment on the spiritual side of the music for these wide range of musicians, all of whom have either some association with spirituality in church or absolutely none whatsoever. They all comment about how they feel, what it's like to play in a sacred space. And it totally, in other words, having them not do something ribald, for example, is real. You don't have to tell them that.
Yes.
They sense.
There's a sense of respect for the place, the venue.
And many of them, it's just like, I sort of needed this.
Yeah.
I've played in other kind of settings so often, and playing in a church, it's like, they enjoy it, and it's something that feeds them.
Yes, right,
as well.
Right.
They're not just doing this for the audience.
I've had them say before that sometimes that's the only church they get because of their schedules.
Yeah.
They're out so late, like on a Saturday night or something, that
Exactly.
they just can't drag themselves out on a Sunday.
Sure.
So, and they also are intrigued by the fact that nobody's talking, nobody's drinking, nobody's eating. It's all on them, and some of them say that was a little disconcerting at first.
They're used to playing with the clink of glasses and
yes.
dishes being cleared and that kind of thing.
But they're being listened to and intently.
Yes.
And so the expectation of musicianship is very high there.
Yes.
I would say.
I would too, and when we get it,
Yeah, they
put
rise to
themselves
the
out.
bar.
And is this congregation primarily your own church members, or is this a...
Oh, no.
No, primarily
Much wider.
it's the community.
Yeah.
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 There's a dozen or so from the church from the that congregation who attend.
Right.
But basically, it's a community-wide thing.
Right. You know, we have, when we have the pictures of last year's Miles Ahead, Bill Carter's at the piano. Bill, at his church, does jazz as well. I have brought the video of Jazz Belongs in Church, and then his latest CD, which is called Jazz for the Earth. And again, Bill writes psalm settings, and these are reflections on the beauty of the Canadian Rockies. So, you know, he brings a sensibility to everything that he does in his own congregation, but he's also a Presbyterian minister. So these musicians that you're talking about are folks who are coming from all different walks of life. But as you say, there's something about being in that sacred space that creates an ambiance for their music that puts the music in a different context.
It does.
When you design, do you choose thematic services, or
A little bit seasonal, maybe.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But that's really about the extent of it.
Yeah.
There's-
I do a lot of computer searching
Yes.
for stuff
Right.
because I know Art gets tired of hearing the same thing as the year rolls around.
Yeah,
So
right.
I try to get fresh stuff in there and some new ideas, and you know, we've covered almost everything, I think, and people seem to enjoy it.
Good. Our guests today are the Reverend Dr. Art Suggs, who's the pastor of the First Congregational Church in Binghamton on Front Street, and Judy Giblin, who is the coordinator for Jazz Vespers, who's been a part of that church before you were there.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So they're our guests today. We're talking about Jazz Vespers, which happens on the second Sunday of each month, ordinarily, and it's at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So Miles Ahead will be there this coming week. And is there any attempt to look for different styles of music? Is this an educational thing for the congregation?
I try to. I do. You can really, it's easy to fall into the habit of just having the same people because
Yeah.
they're good,
Yeah.
and it would be easy. But I go out and listen. Somebody will say, oh, I heard so-and-so and they were amazing, so I drag my poor husband and we go to wherever they're playing and listen.
Kind of
and,
audition them. Yeah.
There have been a few that just really wouldn't suit,
Yeah.
but if they're jazz or like the big band is, you know, a different sound,
Yes.
but still people like it. So we try to, my intent is always to make it likable,
Yeah.
to make them want to come back and listen again.
Yep.
So, Judy, tell about the October offering where we had the students from Binghamton University.
Oh, that's right. Mike Carbone suggested them. It's the Harper Jazz Conspiracy, also known as the Harper Jazz Ensemble. And it's all students from SUNY Broome, or from, that's where I retired from, from BU.
Yes.
And they are marvelous musicians, and it gives them a chance to play in a different setting.
Sure.
And, you know, they were excellent.
Wow.
They were excellent, but I wouldn't expect any less if Mike Carbone recommended them.
Sure. Now, have you ever invited someone, they said no, they'd rather not play in church?
No, never had that
Always
issue.
had- they've
People
always-
come to me. They want to play.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful. What would happen if they came on Sunday morning? Would that be?
Oh, that'd be lovely.
Yeah.
That'd be just fine. Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
right.
Yeah, because the congregation loves that kind of music, and once
Sure.
again, it's not bar kind of music. You know, it's with a spiritual nature to
Yeah.
it. Oh, it would fit in beautifully.
One of my last Sundays in Trumansburg was my last church, the Presbyterian Church in Trumansburg. And my church musician, Alice Ploss, can play jazz piano. Her husband is a bass player. Their son, Chris, plays drums. And I said, you know, wouldn't it be fun to do a jazz service? So we chose Rain as our theme. I found a psalm that mentioned rain, and then rain falling on the just and the unjust, biblical, you know, the passages. And then they played, I think for the offering, Pennies from Heaven, and the other songs that were a part of this were like Stormy Weather would fit. So it was a thematic service, and no one walked out and said, well, I'm never coming back. Most people would say, when can we do this again?
So your DJ skills kicked in on this to know
Yeah,
which.
that's a blurry line. It's a very blurry line. Yes. When, again, going back to the spiritual nature of jazz, what is it about jazz that lends itself to worship?
I think it's a rather introspective kind of music.
I do too.
Yeah.
I do too. I entered this not being a jazz lover.
Yes.
So I was, as pastor of the church, it's my responsibility to do the meditation on it. So I dutifully did that, and in the process fell in love with jazz. I had no exposure to it ever. Yeah. Until I came to this church, and what it does is, first of all, in that setting, it's not background music. It's music that you are listening intently to, and you're watching it being played by serious artists who are really good at what they're doing. And it's that combination of I don't want this to sound wrong, but Zen-like focus, both on their part and on the person who's watching it, on both parts. Yeah. So it's this focus that's really intent on it, and then you let the melody sort of hit you. You got the drums, you got the sax, you got the piano, and the strings of various types, whether it's guitar or bass. And you sit there and you start to absorb that kind of thing, and it moves you. Yeah. It becomes an emotional event for you.
Yeah, yeah. And improvisation, it seems to me, is the Christian life. We all improvise.
We're not following a script.
That's right. That's right. So we improvise in very important ways day by day from the time you get up in the morning. And jazz is improvisational music. You start with a chart, and then you depart from the chart to let the spirit move you. Even the most secular jazz musician will talk about the spirit of the music, or it took me to a different place, or once I got in the groove, I just went with it. And
music has this notion of variations on a theme.
Yes.
And that's a lot of what they do, is that you have a theme on it, but then you just let the creative juices flow, off you go wherever with a theme, and then you come back. Because I'm sitting there where I sit, I'm typically watching the piano person. Yeah. And so they got one sheet of music on it, and they're playing for a 10-minute piece, and half the time they're not even looking at the piece of music, so or it's not there at all for like Gene Cochran, and several of the others, like, what music? Who needs that? Yeah. But this notion of a theme that you can then just simply use that as your touchstone, but otherwise off you go with the variations.
Well, the life of faith is variations on a theme. The theme is love, and what are the various ways that we enact it and enable it? Yes. Judy, you're a vocalist. So, and I do want to mention too that the same day that Jazz Vespers will be held at First Congregational Church in November, you're going to be singing at the Firehouse Stage. Right. With the Mason Warrington?
Yeah,
Orchestra.
Warrington. Orchestra.
I'm saying it like I would have said it back in Virginia, Warrington. The Mason Warrington Orchestra. So when did you start singing with the big band?
Around 98, I think, about 20 years ago. Yeah. And it just was a coincidence. I just answered the phone at the church one day, and it was the gentleman that did the PR for Mason Warrington, and he said, what do you do when you're not doing this? And I said, I sing a little. And he said, well, you ought to come down to rehearsal. And as it happened, they were rehearsing in our basement Fell Hall.
Oh, but that sounded good, didn't it?
Oh, it did. Yeah. And I came down, and he said later, he says, so many people come to me and say, oh, I can sing, and it ends up like somebody's Aunt Gertrude who can sing all right, but not for this sort of thing. Right. And as it turned out, I was what they wanted. So wonderful. I was very lucky. I wanted to do that since I was 14.
And do you sing during the Jazz Vespers?
I've been known to. I do one of them myself or with another vocalist. Yeah. And so, it's I could be selfish. I could beg to do it every time, and I try to show some restraint there.
Right,
but.
right. Kind of like the preacher's restraint too. With you could probably preach a little bit longer
Right.
each time. My wife used to tell me that I had 3 or 4 conclusions to that sermon. Find one and land on it.
Furthermore.
Yes, that's right. One more thing. Well, so to summarize once again, Jazz Vespers is held at First Congregational Church in Binghamton. It's the only Jazz Vespers around that I know held regularly. And it's the second Sunday at 5 o'clock.
Right. We begin in the fall in October. We used to be in September, but Blues on the Bridge decided
yes.
to annex the second Sunday, and I didn't want to fight with them.
No
Right.
sense in having competition there.
So we do it October through May.
Right, right.
And they should come and try it.
Wonderful.
It's amazing.
Again, it's one of the largest jazz venues in our area. So
And so on the 11th, we have which group?
We have Miles Ahead. And on December 16th, we have Mason Warrington. And I'm also going to be there's a brass quintet that comes. They'll be in February.
Wonderful.
yeah,
Yep.
Yeah.
so that'll be February.
Yep. And there's a group coming out of Ithaca in March. So I've got all but 1 month taken care of this year. It happens to be the last month, so.
Well, I'll bring my harmonica and we'll see how that
Okay,
works out.
you do that.
Once again today, our guests have been Art Suggs, who is the pastor for the time being at the First Congregational Church in Binghamton, and Judy Giblin, who's the coordinator of the Jazz Vespers series held each month. I want to thank you for joining us for the Encounter program, produced in cooperation with WBNG TV, with a studio space here, and the audio track carried on WMBF radio. And the whole thing is sponsored by, or put together by, I'm the volunteer for the Broome County Council of Churches. So this is Jeff Kellam, hoping that in the coming week, you will certainly be gentle with people and with yourself.